Welcome to Not Too Tight, Not Too Loose. I'm Andrew Rose. With me, as always, is Dr. Joe Flanders. How's it going, Joe?
It's going well. Thanks, Andrew. How are you?
Good. So our episode today, really fun one to record with Jonas Mago. Jonas is a cognitive neuroscientist, and he's a meditation teacher, completing his PhD in neuroscience here at McGill University in Montreal. His research is fascinating. It investigates contemplative practices, so everything ranging from Buddhist jhana meditation to charismatic Christian prayer, and how they reshape the dynamics of the brain and body. So working with EEG, fMRI, computational simulations, grounded in active inference, and complexity science. So some deep stuff that Jonas is into, but really exploring how attention, embodied regulation can reorganize neural systems towards greater flexibility, integration, and well-being. So he recently released a preprint, meditative absorption shifts brain dynamics towards criticality. Mouthful there, but we'll get into it a little bit in the episode. And it was based on a first of its kind Jhana retreat study, led by meditation teacher Shaila Catherine. And we talk about this in the episode. So he's a longtime practitioner, certified unified mindfulness coach, and he's interested in how first-person experience can inform neuroscience and how scientific insights can in turn illuminate the path of contemplative practice. So his research is supported by the German Excellence Scholarship Foundation, by the European and American Varela Awards from the Mind and Life Institute. He serves as a co-lead of the Cognition, Learning, and Human Flourishing pillar within MIT's Comparative Global Humanities program, and he's received multiple international honors, including the Usona Institute Scholarship, media features in Time Magazine, The Atlantic, for his pioneering work in neuroscience of deep meditation and collective prayer. So impressive guy. Impressive. Still in his 20s, I think. What did you think of the episode, Joe?
Well, we were just saying before we hit record that he just has expertise in so many of the areas that you and I are interested in, love to chat about. So, meditation, obviously, psychedelics, AI, predictive processing. It's just like feels like Christmas when you get to talk to him.
Uh-huh.
I guess one of the first highlights, maybe one of the most impactful things, was just like how rigorously and cleverly he describes one of the key implications of the predictive processing model, what we now understand about perception and meaning making, that so much of how we experience the world is about our top-down models, more so than like what's actually out there in the matrix, right?
Yeah.
And so, is this really cool fact about like there's way, way, way more neurons going from the visual cortex to the eyes than the other way around, right? It's
Right.
so wild.
Yes.
And then just this intriguing possibility is like, okay, like let's work on the models. Let's like work on our prejudices and our predictions about what's actually out there and what that could do for our health and well-being. So just like really kind of inspiring setup or framing, and then the possibility of all these amazing, mental technologies like meditation or whatever that could help us with that. So that was kind of one of, really landed well for me, that first piece.
Yeah. And a nice compliment too, just for our listeners, if they're interested. The last episode we released with Sarah Birkenfeld, we talk about neurodiversity, but she and IFS, but she also gets a fair bit into predictive processing models. So a nice complement between these two episodes. And
Right.
what I thought, one of the things that was so interesting and rich about this episode with Jonas, even though he's a neuroscientist, computational scientist, things can get pretty technical, but at the same time, we're ending up talking about things like manifesting and magic when we examine the implications of perception shaping the world. And I think there's some really important conversations there around the distinction between doing that in terms of cultivating well-being, and then where that can move into spiritual bypassing, and then also just questions about like, well, when you're doing this with others, like, this whole idea of the photons being the photons, like it's being something consistent. And I'm saying like, well, I'm not so sure it is. So things do get loose,
Yeah.
despite the tight some of
Yeah.
the tight orientation there. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like also related to the sort of the second highlight for me, which is, we can come at these discussions with basic assumptions like, oh yeah, well, this is going to help us achieve enlightenment or help us like be more well or healthy or something. And then when you actually get into the kind of granular discussions, you understand like, well, actually, what we're pointing all these practices to is not super well defined, right? A
Hmm.
lot depends on how you define or think about well-being or enlightenment. A lot depends on what kind of lineage you're practicing in. Is it Buddhist? Is it Christian? Is it secular? Is it clinical? All these things. And then we find very quickly that the discussion ends up being like similar to many discussions we have in psychedelics. It ends up being like a set and setting kind
Right.
of kind of
Yes.
discussion. And so that was also super interesting. It's just like, what is the context that we're doing this in, and what are your intentions?
Yeah.
And so yeah, obviously he's really thoughtful about that, and just really stimulating.
He's diplomatic too at various points in the episode when we go in those directions, and sort of says, well, I put my hands up. I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure I'm going to be able to define enlightenment, or even well-being, right? I think that's one of the places where we try and orient to more pragmatic matters, especially for listeners of the podcast. We're trying to share some of the
Right.
wisdom that might be surfacing here in terms of how to be more well, but very quickly we end up having to establish some common ground in terms of like what we mean by that, and
Yeah.
not just what we mean by that for an individual, but what we mean by that collectively, right? And then things become moral very quickly. You start to there's what's interesting is how it points to to the extent that a lot of these practices, and we get into it with some of the jhana practice, they're typically embedded in spiritual traditions that
Right.
have moral frameworks, and
Right.
there's a reason for that, because without it, this can just become technology that can go off in all kinds of different directions, which may not be helpful, or may be helpful to one worldview and harmful to another. Um, so really, yeah, it gets paradoxical quickly, but
Yeah.
Jonas is so equanimous and thoughtful and grounded that it doesn't go off the rails. Although we should prepare folks that we do dive right in. We should
Right.
do dive right into the conversation. But he does a good job of then zooming back out to give context for his work.
One of the things that's so interesting about Jonas,
Mhm.
like he's
Terrible guy.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
so, so
just
unlikable.
intolerable. Can't be with him. But he's asking all these interesting scientific questions about these practices, right? And as we just said, it gets complex. Except that uh, just talking to him or being with him kind of gives you all the evidence you need
Hmm.
to understand or appreciate the impact of this kind of dedication to a spiritual practice. Because, and I think this comes across in the interview, but if it doesn't, it definitely comes across when you're with him in person. It's like calm, joyful, super present,
Hmm.
generous in spirit, like, and it's like it's amazing. And so, yeah, like I said, that's kind of all the evidence I need to be like, okay, well, whatever this guy has, I'd like to get a little bit more of it. And it was interesting because one of the things he said, I don't want to spoil it, but he does name that he had like a privileged upbringing,
Hmm.
right? And it's
Hmm.
like, oh, okay, well, is it that? Is it his meditation practice? And just really interesting. Kind of, I'm kind of like trying to figure that out as I interact
Right.
with him more and more.
Well, you're supposed to take your time investigating the teacher, Joe. Don't be sold. Don't be sold just based on one podcast or appearances, right? No, but he does embody all of that, right? And he's a serious practitioner. So it should be clear there. He does embody it. It does come through, and he does also is careful to acknowledge, his good karma. I think I framed it that way, right? But he's careful to acknowledge that. And then we do have an interesting conversation towards the end where we do bring it back again to this question of entry points for folks,
Yeah.
who might want some of what he's got, right? And like, how realistic is it to for your average person who may not have much of a meditation experience to think that they're going to go and access deep equanimity and jhana states like right out of the gate, right? And then we inevitably end up talking a bit about psychedelics and the sort of as technology, right, as sort of reference points, entry points that can be helpful, but also with risk. And similarly, AI, right? So he's also like as he says, a computational scientist, really interested in how AI might be helpful here in terms of finding paths that can be accelerated and um, personally attenuated, right? And we talks about some parallels there, and the part of the research that he's doing is interviewing teachers in spiritual traditions around personal interviews, right? This
Mm.
personalized kind of spiritual path. So really interesting parallels there. And then of course, and we also talk about again, similar to psychedelics, some of the risks there. This
Mhm.
question that we've of the what we call the alignment problem. And parallels where the moral framework stuff comes up a few times. So just really interesting ground across the board.
Yeah, super rich. I feel like if we keep talking,
Gonna
gonna
spoil it.
we're gonna
All right. Well,
spoil it. Yeah.
let's hop into the episode. Here's our interview with Jonas Mago. Enjoy. Okay. Welcome to Not Too Tight, Not Too Loose, the podcast about finding balance in the pursuit of well-being. With me, as always, is Dr. Joe Flanders,
Morning.
and we have the great pleasure of welcoming Jonas Mago to the podcast. Jonas, welcome.
Hey guys, good to be with you. You two here today.
Welcome and welcome home or welcome back. I know you were away and traveling, and I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. So many things I want to talk about, but I'm the first question I have is just how was your trip? Tell us what you were up to.
It's great. The whole year has been full with trips, and this last one I've just been in or near Atlanta for 10 days with a meditation teacher called Jhana,
Mm-hmm.
and we've been out there on a 10-day meditation retreat and following 24, 25 of her students throughout the 10 days of the retreat and kind of measuring a bunch of EEG and self-report measures to kind of get a sense of what's happening in brains and bodies and experience when you're diving deep into practice for a longer time.
So
And
so
yeah,
what
and it's been not only work, but also the chance to just sit with some of them for a little bit and kind of not only do the research, but also just practice and be in practice.
so you're practicing with them while you were studying them as well.
Well, like the ideal case would be that I can practice with them all day. Effectively, it looks like I have a couple of hours in between measuring sessions where I can be there and listen to the talks of the teacher and kind of do my own practice. But
Uh-huh.
it's more like 2 or 3 hours than 8 or 12, as most of the people there do.
So tell us about the retreat. What kind of practices are you doing, and what are you measuring, and what are you finding?
Yeah. Um, Bunch of big questions.
Uh-huh.
Let me start with this specific retreat.
Yes.
This specific retreat is Shalakathan is known for a practice called Jhana meditation,
Mm-hmm.
which is the very short version is a very advanced concentration practice where kind of most people will probably know focused attention meditation, where you have your attention that's wobbling around to kind of process the environment, and you bring it to the nose or to whatever object, then it wobbles, and you bring it back, and you bring it back. And these practitioners, they've just done this for so long that attention can just remain at the object they choose for a long, long time, which then leads to a cascade of interesting experiences, starting from perceiving internal light phenomena called nimitta, to then phenomena that are called jhanas or absorption states, where there's a lot of wakefulness, but the content of experience gently deconstructs and collapses so that you have a state of consciousness with just a couple of contents that are very refined. And in this very retreat, they used a practice called metta, or loving kindness, as the object to cultivate these absorption states.
And so, what are you? Thanks for that. I'm tempted to talk more about Jhana, but maybe just we could talk a little bit about what you're actually trying to measure at this retreat.
Can I
Sure.
actually just jump in?
Yeah.
I want to make sure I understand. So when you say something like the structure of experiences collapses or something like that, and you end up with just like a small or like limited content or something. Can you just explain what that means? What's collapsing?
Totally. Well, I think it's interesting to understand that in contrast to ordinary experience. In ordinary experience, there's a manifold of content that appears in our awareness. Right now, I see you, I hear you, I'm aware of my room, and kind of my attention jumps around between all of those objects. And if you think of the psychedelic state, you kind of amplify that. If you're on psychedelics, you kind of get an increase, an influx in the amount of data that you process, and it's kind of this like the sensory input is just very full. And this is probably as much of the opposite as it can be. So this is a state where experientially there isn't much of this wobbling and wavering of experience. Like imagine a state where the stream of experience is incredibly stable. And it's not stable with a lot of content like vision and seeing and hearing at the space. All you experience is a couple of handful of what they call Jhana factors. So these include an experience of joy and of happiness, something that they call one-pointedness, which is kind of a term for like a very simple, unified sense of experience. So it's a little bit like all this manifold complex experience of daily life is unifying into a very single, hyper-focused state. And the interesting thing is, it's nothing that you need to push your mind into. Somehow the mind finds an equilibrium where it balances and stays in this. But now you can let go of effort. You don't need to keep moving your attention towards it. At this point, you can just relax and attention is stable on this absorptive, stable experience. And you just hang out here without much other distracting experiences.
Is the positive affective valence of it just naturally there, or are you cultivating that?
It's actually really, really interesting distinction between how different traditions practice this. There's a couple of traditions where they speak about these states as states where you cultivate the positive affect. They often speak about piti, which is this internal joy. Shaila Catherine and the tradition in the old Burmese tradition that we work with, they're very explicit in saying you do not cultivate this joy. You do not try to increase that joy. Much rather, you stabilize attention, and all of the positive affect comes as a side effect and comes as an indicator. And the argument there is, if you focus on the attention and let the positive affect come as like a result or effect or side effect, that this allows you to step much more deeply into the stabilization, much deeper into the positive affect, which then, as a side note, this like at the beginning can be somewhat intense. It can be physical. It can be like energetically intense in some ways. But this is only the beginning. As when you hang out at this joy pity state for a while, you then progress to its deeper and deeper states, where more of the joy and like what we would call like pleasure fades away, and deeper equanimity arises, which is experienced practitioners talk about as a lot more gratifying and rewarding than what we would ordinarily call pleasure or sense pleasure.
So
Cool.
is equanimity the goal?
Yeah, I think in many ways.
Why do this? Why do this? Just to ask the basic question. Is it if it's equanimity over pleasure, is that one way to put it, or is it, or the pursuit of enlightenment, or what are you trying to do?
Well, I think it depends on how serious you want to take the path. If you want to take the deep end, then enlightenment is the aim here. I think it's probably difficult to kind of pin down what that is, and I think I'm not qualified to pin down what enlightenment is. But if you just step a tiny bit back, the argument in these traditions is that deep cultivated equanimity comes with a certain quality of joy that is more rewarding and sustaining and pleasurable than ordinary pleasure. Like the idea in some senses, if we hold on to sense pleasure like eating the ice cream and kind of sense pleasures through, I don't know, sexuality or so, that they are beautiful and that they're nice. And the argument is the pleasure that is cultivated through the path of equanimity is somehow different, is somehow more stable, somehow more longer lasting. At this retreat, the teacher was very explicit that anyone she knows who has ever practiced these states was very clear that they much prefer the quality of feeling of those states over any other sense pleasure they ever had in their life.
Jonas, can you, I'm craving a little bit of like broader context here. I'm thinking, for example, of a listener who, might have done mindfulness meditation or something, or has like a general understanding of meditation and the Buddhist path or something. But this is a very interesting and I think very like new and sexy corner of Buddhism right now. Can you just like flesh that out a little bit? Like, what is this practice and how does it relate to practices that are maybe more widely known by your average person?
Totally. And I think what helps is I would just do a massive zooming out here in a moment and we can zoom back in. And which is maybe zooming out to kind of the overall interest of my my kind of PhD and contemplative practice, which is I really want to understand how do contemplative practices affect experience in the body. And contemplative practices are kind of a whole family of things where people do some sort of practice or ritual to influence their relationship to the world. In the Christian tradition, people develop rituals of prayer to speak to God. They come together, they have masses, they read scriptures. In the Buddhist tradition, the most common thing is meditation, where you sit down and you either do nothing or you do certain attention practices. And then in Sufi traditions, you have dance, and in many other traditions, you have many other practices. And so that's kind of the question of like, why do people do these? And what does it do to their experience? And one of the subfamilies that I focus on is the Buddhist path, where one of the common practices is you're interested in how does attention, how does your way of perceiving the world influences what you perceive. And in that practice, the most common thing is you somehow sit down or walk or stand, but sitting is most common. You sit down and to try to become skillful in how attention moves around. And with attention, you move around the window of data that you take in from the environment. You try to make it smaller, you might try to make it bigger. You try to focus on your own body, you try to focus on the world. And the skill in these traditions is to be good in this movement of attention. How's that? It's like a kind of general intro of what meditation does.
To be good at that skill, I'm with you, but to what end?
The deep end here is that the place where I come from is a place where I believe that most of how we perceive the world is not actually dependent on what the state of the world is. It is mostly dependent on how I relate to the world. So whether a certain setting is inducing anxiety in me, or whether it is inducing deep joy of kind of being people I love around me, to a large depends upon the projections that I have towards that space around me. And I think that is incredibly important. And neuroscience is starting to back that up more and more and more. Like one of the stunning things is if we look at how visual data is processed. We have the eyes, and then at the back of the head, we have the visual cortex. And for a long time, the way perception was believed to work is data is coming into the eyes and is then processed in the visual cortex. New research now shows is that we have a lot more neurons going from the visual cortex towards the eyes. So you spend a lot more energy trying to predict and anticipate what is out there in the world. And kind of numbers vary a little bit, but let's throw a random number out there. Maybe 80% of perception and experience is us predicting and expecting what we perceive. And if we take that serious, that 80% of what we perceive is our prejudices towards the world and not actually what the world gives us, then most of the reality as we know it is influenced and shaped and colored by how we relate towards it. And thinking this one step further, if I relate to the world and keep pointing out and only looking and anticipating the things that are difficult, stressful, harmful, dangerous, then I start living in a world that is incredibly challenging and difficult and uncomfortable. And I think there's many people who work on now figuring out how specific disorders emerge from this, like anxiety, depression, like there's a whole family of those. And the opposite of this is if we become skillful in looking at the world, relating to the world from a different perspective. What if I allow that I look at the world and kind of point out the beauty more than the difficulty, point out the generosity more than the zero-sum game mentality, then slowly my perception of the world changes more and more and more. And my relation to reality changes. And that's the hope underlying these practices, that by changing how we perceive, reality changes as we know it.
I'm going to pass it back to Andrew, but one more is the idea with the cultivating the jhana states, getting good at developing these jhana states, is that you're actually tilting perception into these more positive or equanimous states. You're just more readily and likely to be in those frames of mind.
Yeah, I would. I think jhana is it's possibly a little bit more of an edge case. Again, I think jhanas are not necessarily a place where I try to keep reinforcing positive ways of perceiving. I think jhanas are based on like stabilizing attention, and they come as a side effect of it. Mm-hmm. But I also think you're not too wrong. When we think of maybe the general answer is to say, yes, jhanas, just like other meditation practices, are a way to shifting attention in ways that are beneficial. And I slightly lift my hands to like what is beneficial. It is not always the seeking out of more sense pleasure. In some ways, that is what I would call addiction. Or like someone who is addicted to opioids, the brain becomes really good in trying mechanisms to predict what behavior leads to really good experiences. Like if I take another opioid, I have very high predictability that it will make me feel really, really good. And how I would think of kind of mindfulness meditation a bit more, you start to learn patterns of like what will make the system feel well over time. What deployment of attention patterns leads to a stability and wholesomeness of mind that feels joyous, stable over a long period of time. And I think that is what mindfulness practice is doing. And if you get really good at this, you do get certain feedback rewards. You get into certain states that are indicators of this. And one of such indicators is jhanas and absorptions, where you feel so safe, where you feel so well, that your mind feels safe to really stabilize without moving around and trying to look for danger and harm.
This is a really interesting balance, Jonas, when you name, the pursuit of pleasure or a certain model that is narrow, and then equating it with addiction, almost as if like the actual the actual way that it functions, there's nothing wrong with that. Is like, I predict that this is going to make me feel good, but it's not a very broad or useful model. So it doesn't end up actually helping, right? You end up getting more and more entrenched.
Totally.
I want to, this idea that our perceptions shape our experience is probably a very familiar one to folks in various spiritual traditions. What I think is interesting about this is the actual neuroscience component that complements it, because listening to someone say, well, all of your negative experiences, your anxiety, your pain, it's just because that you're focusing on the bad stuff. Just focus on the good stuff, and you'll have a pleasant life, and you know there's very easy to critique that as a form of spiritual bypassing, right? Where it's like, come on, that's not really fair. This is a really painful, hard situation. You're telling me like these practices or these tools are just going to make all of this stuff go away, and it's just really sticking my head in the sand. So I wonder if you could speak a bit more to the free energy principle, and how how this predictive processing model actually gives some evidence and credence to this
Totally.
idea of your perception really actually shaping your reality. And then, how can folks actually cultivate this in a way that's useful?
Totally. Um, and use some interesting terms there, like predictive processing and active inference. Predictive processing, we already touched upon just now a little bit, right? So the idea of predictive processing is that, what I said, we spend more energy in anticipating and predicting experience than data actually coming in. And there kind of comes this general idea that what we're trying to do, or what we can do, is by changing these expectations, we change how we actually perceive the world. And now this has been implemented in math. And my co-supervisor, Carl Friston, is kind of one of the leading thinkers and kind of the original thinker behind what we call active inference, which is the mathematical formalism of this, where the idea is, I don't want to go too much into the math. There's a lot of math around this. The direction would be here Bayesian statistics and Bayesian inference. But there's a simple version of that, which is we have some priors or some expectations, some ideas of what we think is out there in the world. And then we have actual data that is perceived by our eyes. And somehow the merging of those two lead to a posterior, or leads to what I would call like experience or consciousness, in quotation marks. And now in active inference, the interesting part is that what the system is always trying to do is to match the data that is coming in with our expectation of it as close as possible. The argument here is that what makes an organism alive is that it is able to reduce the difference between those two. And what it means to reduce the difference is to make my experience match as closely as possible with what is out there in the world. Because if I'm hallucinating all the time, then I can't avoid danger, and I can't really pursue food and whatever I need to survive. Now, to match data and expectations, there's two ways of how we can do this. We can either change the expectations to make it match the world a bit better, or we can change the world to make it match our data a bit better. And now it is this very moment where it becomes really interesting, and where this whole spiritual bypassing part comes in, where sure, we can keep living in this hallucinated like world, right? If I live in bad conditions, I don't have food, I'm physically sick, I can keep building up this or this view that I'm well and all is good, but over the long run, it doesn't actually make the system stable and able to survive, because the actual reality of the world diverges more and more and more from this internal model that you live in, and you kind of detach and dissociate from the world. So somehow, for a system to flourish, you need to both align your expectations with something that actually matches the world, and now change the world so it keeps matching your kind of internal predictions or expectations of the world. And it's kind of in this interplay where to kind of really master this inferential loop, this perceptual loop, requires both internal work on the way of how attention works and external work on cultivating a setting and surrounding and a life that matches these internal priors.
Okay.
I actually, if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind
Go.
fleshing that a little bit more. This thing about bypass and changing the world, I think is super interesting. I wonder if you have another example. This thing about, I'm unwell and I'm not eating healthy, but I just convince myself that I'm well. I wonder if there's an example that's sort of closer to what an average person might experience. Like, what does it mean to change the data or to change the world? I think that's a bit counterintuitive. I'm not actually changing the photons coming in, right? The world is the world. I can't change that. So what does it mean? Like the idea of changing your expectations or changing your priors, I think is easier for us to understand. It's like the sort of acceptance and like adapting to the feedback we're getting back. But what does it mean to do the opposite?
Sure. One fantastic example of how we think action works in this framework. I have this bottle, and if I want to grab that bottle, the main predictive processing theory of how action works is I first imagine that I've already grabbed the bottle. So my internal perception is now already encoding that I already hold the bottle. But now my hand doesn't match that internal perception. So now by making that internal expectation, my hand just tries to match that internal model. So somehow my anticipation slightly precedes the actual action of my hand.
Yep.
And it's very similar when you think of like doing kind actions, right? It's like when I want to be a kind person, a kind, generous person who people like around me, it's like, I don't really like the term, and I'm a bit worried of like the way it's used, but it kind of is something like manifesting. If I sit down in the morning and I'm like, I'm going to be a kind person, I'm going to be a generous person, you start to have a self-perception that in the moment that there is someone who doesn't have money and needs a few dollars to buy a sandwich, you already expect yourself to be someone who's kind to give a bit of money. And now you just follow to fulfill that perception. And so there's something where your internal kind of perceptions kind of prime you to do certain actions. And the spiritual bypassing would be a case where you keep making these internal models. You don't follow up physically with what you kind of anticipate to do. And that creates pretty deep suffering where now you have this mismatch. And that is probably what we think suffering or the opposite of well-being is.
That's interesting.
There's all kinds of other, interesting implications to this, Jonas. And you mentioned, you have hesitation and to mention manifesting, and I understand why, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's easy to make that association. Things start to get a little magical, right? Like I'm even curious about talking about, Joe said, well, hold on, how do you change the world? The photons are the photons. And I'm the looser one here. I'm like, I'm not so sure. Like maybe, maybe the perception does affect those, right? Things start to get slippery in terms of, hey, what are you creating? Because it's you live in relationship with the world, right? And we're thinking about the world in terms of a bottle of water is one thing, but what about another being in the world that you're trying to relate to? What if they're doing the same thing? What does that dance look like? And then I guess a question beyond that is, it's lovely that your example is, concentrating on or using these practices with a framework to, be more compassionate and kind, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the model either, does it? I mean, what are some of the darker, implications of this potentially, right? And these practices, insofar as they emerged in Buddhist traditions, are also situated in moral contexts in Shila, right? And so I wonder if this is an appropriate time to talk about what are some of the reactions from tradition to investigating these practices, these tools, and the power that it actually might have to manifest all kinds of things in the world.
Yeah. I love that question, and I think you're right. And I think our world is full of examples where very similar mechanisms lead to outcomes that do the opposite of well-being. You have like one example is like filter bubbles, where if you start having certain opinions of some sort, not only do kind of algorithms feed that back, but even in the world, if I have the perception that a certain population of the group is dangerous or is kind of difficult or so, I start perceiving those qualities more and more and more. If I start having an internal model that that violence is the way to solve certain things, and I see all the possibilities of violence kind of could be a viable path towards things. Right? Like there's a lot of specific examples we could go into, but in general, yes, the same mechanism works not only up like one way, but the other way as well. And it might be for that reason that my experience doing this work in different spiritual communities, both in North America, but also in Asia, has always been that the teachers have been quite careful in making sure that I portray these practices in the right light, in the right tradition, in the right context, with the right care. And especially these days, there's an interesting time because you have many of these long-standing traditions. In the meditation, it's the Buddhist tradition. In prayer, it's the Christian tradition. But you now have this emergent kind of secular approach where people kind of take these practices from a secular point of view, where they take them kind of from a like neurohacking point of view, where it's like, we don't care about the traditions. We don't care about all these other practices. We just have this one piece and we want to optimize it. We want to kind of optimize the manifesting thing as much as possible. We give you all the tools and techniques that you can kind of manifest whatever you want to manifest without much training in the kind of ethical space. And sure, it will probably work. And I actually think there's a lot that we can learn, that the traditional practices can learn from, to kind of integrate more novel kind of tools for this. But my experience from teachers from these traditions is they're quite worried about this. They're quite worried about taking these practices and developing and moving them too quick, because developing a specific technique is easy, but embedding it in a framework of ethics, being very careful and observing how does a certain practice impact how we relate as a community. Do we as a community actually work better or worse? How do we as a community have impact on larger society? And those are questions that I, as a neuroscientist, have very hard time answering or even investigating. And that's why I'm incredibly lucky that I work with an anthropologist, where anthropologists around me are asking those questions. And so there's this constant dialogue and understanding, how do certain mechanisms in the brain relate to actions of the individual, relate to an impact on culture and society? And this stack is a lot more complex than just a little hacky thing.
What's the risk in this neurohacky framework? What are the teachers concerned about as they're watching this unfold?
I think there's a couple of different things. The worry that I hear most often is that we're optimizing for the wrong thing.
Like an alignment problem.
Like
we're going to get to that.
Like an alignment problem, right? And we can get to the alignment in AI later, but the question is alignment in humans. If we think about there being whatever spectrum of possible states of consciousness or experience, right? Then you have things like bipolar depression, anxiety, or so somewhere on one end, and then you have well-being on the other end. And now the worry is that kind of teachers who think they've cultivated states that are deep well-being, right? And different traditions speak differently around it, might be awakening, whatever. Then the worry is that what's happening in the neurotech space is that we optimize for another state that is not quite there, that we kind of like prioritize a certain state that is stopping short of what deep well-being could actually mean. And that by doing that, we forget that we can actually cultivate deeper states of well-being.
And which might depend on community, right? When you're leaving
Totally.
out layers of culture, you might be actually missing some key ingredients.
Totally. And so that's the one worry. And then the other worry is that these states, that there might be a lot more dynamic, that what it means to cultivate well-being is not just a state of the brain or of the individual, that it is a state of kind of like dynamic interaction, that it's not being rigid, that deep well-being is not a certain rigidity of the mind. And I think that's like very common if you have people that practice for a while, is at some point there's this peak where they're like, I really found what well-being means. And to cultivate this, I need to meditate 3 hours. I can't have anyone with a bad mood around me. And I can't watch the news because they make it difficult.
Right.
So to be well, I need to cut all of this out and need to live in this bubble. And then I can be well.
Too tight.
Too tight.
Too tight.
Right.
So, but too loose isn't right either.
Right. And then the other idea of being like totally stopping practices and just being out at the bar all night again and having
embracing anything and everything without exception.
So does that work as a kind of starter? Maybe not either. But the kind of trick here is, how can I have a practice and yet have equanimity around living in a world that is changing? And that is, in my experience, not something that is, there's not a fixed point that cultivates this. This is something that is a rather kind of moment-to-moment adaptation process. That's why at this retreat, the teacher spends so much time with one-on-one interviews. What's going on in your life? Where do you come from to arrive at this retreat? What will benefit you to work with these practices? And the worry is that if we try to kind of scale them too quickly, that this is another factor that is difficult to implement. I personally don't think it's necessarily a limit. I think there might be ways where we can learn and kind of scale these practices, being mindful of these. But there is a worry that at the moment where we kind of, the first initial project start with this is a big question.
I wonder, I want to talk about the one-on-one interviews, but I wonder before we get to that, like this idea of that point, right, where you're like, well, it's well-being or whatever, like that goal that we're not quite reaching. You know, even at the beginning of our conversation, where we're like, well, what's the intention? Is it enlightenment? And we're like, we seem kind of content to just have it be out there and like gesturing at it generally. And I think maybe it's okay that it's not a fixed point, but it does seem to me that it's really important that we have some kind of framework or idea or like worldview for what we're going for, you know. And we talk about these traditions having, you know, these frameworks and that being kind of those being guardrails for the practices, but it's also worth naming that a lot of the institutions that have, you know, come to be and existed alongside a lot of these traditions haven't exactly been without fault. Right, in terms of the kinds of things that resulted within those traditions, right? So, like, is it important to define what we're going for, right? Like, what does well-being really mean beyond? And maybe there is a paradox here where it's like, well, it's very contextual, it's very personal, but also being relational. Like, how good of a job can we do trying to define what a well world looks like, and one that actually takes into account all the data that's available, right? I don't know.
I love that question, and it's one of the challenges that I'm sitting with a lot. I'm coming not only from neuroscience but from computational sciences. So I'm trying to take the data and then simulate it. Ideally, I would kind of, the optimal case would be that I study a system so well that I can just simulate it in a computer, that I can kind of simulate simulate a certain brain that is meditating and then see how it changes until it has reached complete awakening. Some of that feels very intriguing to me, but it's also very difficult. And neither do I have yet found the kind of configuration or definition of that endpoint, nor anyone else really. And I sometimes wonder if that is really part of it. I hear many teachers kind of speak about that endpoint as something that to really understand it, you need to experience it, right? Like a kind of experiencing rather than studying it. I lift my hands to that a little bit. I think it is important to define this in some ways, especially as algorithms have a stronger and stronger influence on how they shape our mind. And having a very clear idea of the state that we want them to cultivate in our minds feels really helpful. And I think much of my work and our work is trying to make that definition clearer and clearer. But I also think there's so many traditions out there that might have slightly different endpoints, and that I think there's a bit of mystery that is up for practitioners that are very experienced in these traditions to really know where these paths can lead towards. And so the best we can do is observe a community, think about whether the certain behaviors in that community are some that we think are worthwhile, and then use that as a measuring stick of whether we engage with those or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wonder if there's a segue there in terms of this question of like, what are these algorithms cultivating to what are we cultivating right now with the algorithms and the technology that we have in this sort of like escalating sense. We had a conversation with Sarah Birkenfield in the last episode about predictive processing, and inevitably we ended up talking about AI and AI therapy. And there's a form of technology and modeling that people are accessing and reinforcing in very accelerating fashion. I wonder, and Jonas, I know you've spoken with great excitement about that, the potential of that.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's worth pivoting there briefly in the context of this conversation, because this is happening very quickly. You hearing that folks are using Chat GPT. The number one use is for some form of therapy. So there are models or language models that people are then using to reinforce potentially whatever information or data they have. What do you see as the potential here for AI to support people on their manifesting quests, I guess,
Totally.
for their lives, to put it one way. And I'd also like to talk about some of the risks of that in the context of this conversation.
I think to really understand this, it's important to think about how these models are built.
Mm-hmm.
And the main mechanisms of how large language models are built these days is that you have something that's called an optimization function. So you have a model that kind of does its whole thing through different layers and kind of neural networks, and then it produces an outcome. And then what you have is a so-called optimization function. So some function that is now telling the model whether this outcome was good or bad. If it's good, then keep doing it. If it's bad, then keep changing something to change the outcome. It's a little bit more difficult than that, but in simple terms, that's how these things are trained. Another question is like, what are we trying to optimize these models for? And the kind of classic optimization functions that we have in the field are, one is accuracy. So accuracy would be try to generate information, and then we kind of try to compare it to other information. So if you try to generate text, then let's see how similar is this to other text that humans have written. Is it very similar or is it very different? And now these models got really, really good in generating text that reads as if a human has written it. And that's incredible. Now you could kind of move one step further and try make the text not only sound like a human, but sound like a human and also be accurate. And so these models get more and more accurate. And now you could kind of think a little bit further, where you like, I want a model that sounds good, is kind of true, but also makes people spend a lot of time with this algorithm. And now it can start generating responses that get positive feedback if somehow they have as a consequence that users engage with this certain outcome longer for more time. And now you can kind of think this further and further and kind of changing what are you trying to optimize these algorithms for. And I think the default by which we're set up right now is generate algorithms that just have the longest user interaction time, which is the same optimization function that we have for social media, which already works incredibly well when we look at the rise of the last couple of years from TikTok and other apps that use shorts. They're incredibly addictive already. And now that's kind of the shadow side where I think we get more addictive, we spend more times with these algorithms, and I lift my hands to what the intention is of the main leaders behind these companies, but there could be a world where they decide to prefer answers that keep users engaged over those answers that are actually true or accurate.
Hmm.
So kind of that's one interesting question. But now thinking one step further is, are we able to somehow make the optimization function one that prioritizes answers that make people feel well? So would we be able to tell the model whether a certain answer helps someone to get better or feel better over feeling worse? And if we're now able to do that, we could now nudge all of these models to keep giving output that nudges people towards feeling better. And maybe that includes giving an answer where people are like, okay, I have enough. I don't need to keep engaging with this model. And in principle, if just like AI models have been able to solve all other tasks, if we have this optimization function, I think they could get incredibly good in learning to generate the type of speech or text that makes people feel well. Just like a therapist. A therapist learns over many years to say the things that will make his patient feel better over a long time.
No, challenge. I know, Andrew, you're spinning here too. My intention when I talk to my clients is not to make them feel well, right? Maybe it's just a question of like how the level of resolution. Mm-hmm. It's like sometimes I say things that makes them uncomfortable because I'm challenging a unhelpful assumption or helping them get unstuck, in a model that's causing suffering. So maybe this is not what you mean, but like one of the most highly publicized issues is how sycophantic they are, right?
I love that. And this is, and like, let me push back here because this is exactly the question where like all of this comes back to how do we define this function that tells what makes people feel well?
Yes, the alignment problem.
The alignment, yeah, and that's like, or the optimization function. Yeah. Is the thing that we want to tell the algorithm that people feel kind of joyous for a couple of minutes afterwards, or to develop a character, like character building, right, a persona building that is somehow doing stable and well and good kind of long term, which means having the ability to stand with discomfort, having a certain outlook on like, who do I want to be in 40 years, that they can kind of open their time horizon, that they are able to kind of accept challenges for a couple of years to come if they know that they kind of want to cultivate a certain healthy relationship that requires difficult conversations. But if the value is to have a family with kids that is together, then maybe a short-term difficulty is there.
Right.
And that's exactly the point where like, we need to think about the function of like optimizing for what? What is the well-being?
Yeah.
And that is the thing where at the moment, the only way we have is like how kind of happy or not happy feel people in the moment. That is like how much they engage with the algorithm. And that is the thing that we need to change. And that's where I would love to speak to meditation teachers. Like, what are you looking out for in your students? What makes someone kind of cultivate good traits? And if that answer if we can answer that question, that is, I think, what generates these algorithms that are actually beneficial.
Yes. Yeah. So this is the same question as we had before around the pleasure versus equanimity, right? And the pleasure piece being if it's too narrow, then it's actually you're just going to manifest addiction rather than a longer view. Jonas, this is where I want to come back to the one-on-one interviews piece, because this can be so contextual, right? Like, what might be helpful for one person in a moment, they might require a little bit of like validation, right? A little bit of like regulation to actually relax the system and be open to some feedback, some challenges, right? If you push too hard out of the gates at someone, they're going to protect, they're going to retreat, they're not going to be open to any kind of
Totally.
slow, subtle change, right? So that might be required, and then you sort of stack that. But it's not a one size fits all. So we had a conversation recently where we were talking about these sort of parallel tracks. On the one hand, precision psychiatry and like what actually might be possible with this technology to sort of understand someone's physiology, their brain chemistry, et cetera. Like what kinds of interventions might be helpful in a really targeted way. But also there's a long, these wisdom traditions have these practices of interview, right? Of personal relationship, this idea of skillful means in Buddhism, of different people receiving different teachings depending on where they're at. So I wonder if you could speak to what you're investigating, or what you're hoping to find, and pull from these wisdom traditions that might be useful in this context.
Um, there is I think there's two answers here. One is kind of fake, but probably the truest I can say, which is I don't fully know yet. I think that is, but I think so far all the answers that we found so far, which is like maybe it is the pleasure in the body. Turns out it's kind of coming short of what the actual aim is. Maybe it is just equanimity. It's also falling a bit short, because you need equanimity, but also dedication. And so, I think that's where what the answer comes towards is skillful means in these Buddhist traditions mean a balanced integration of many things. And there's many different metaphors for that. Like, I think in your intro talk, you had the idea of the instrument, the stringed instrument, which like the string only sounds nice if it's not too loose and not too tight. It's another metaphor is the bird, where you want to have kind of equanimous awareness, but also like fierce attention. And you need both. And if you only have one, then the bird will go to one side. So I'm just like, I just agree there is a certain interaction of all of them. And then on this retreat, something neat that we've done is every evening we ask people to kind of make a trace for like different qualities that they experienced, like difficulty, or how stable was your attention, or how much sensory pleasure was there. And they made a little trace of like, in the morning it was high, and then it got less, and then it got more. And so with all these traces, we can see, how do those experiences change over 10 days? Is it a linear thing where they just cultivate some qualities over others? Or is a certain like non-linear trend where kind of experiences kind of co-occur in some moments and then diverge? And what I'm interested in is understanding which of these qualities are the ones that are most reliable in tracking kind of growth and development through these practices. But I don't yet have an answer.
What are you finding?
Um, One incredibly interesting finding of our most recent study that we've preprinted not too long ago is on another meditation retreat where people were practicing Jhana. And what we found is the headline is, these types of meditation move the brain closer towards a state of criticality. And criticality is a really interesting state in the brain that is defined by being a state where the system is most sensitive to its perturbation. And what that means is, imagine a pile of sand where you kind of keep dropping individual sand grains on it. And for a long time, nothing will happen. And at some point, you have this entire landslide where entire parts of the pile slide down. And in physics, this state is really interesting. That's the state where water transitions into gas or ice. That's a state where like physical systems kind of can reach transitions. And what we have now found is that the human brain in these states of meditation are reaching very similar states, where somehow the brain is at this point of criticality, where it can shift from one mode of operating to another mode, which means it's neither too rigid, so it's not kind of locked into one way of operating or perceiving, but it's also not purely chaotic, so also not just fully random. And often consciousness, wakefulness, is argued to be the optimal point between full order and full chaos. And what we've now found is that meditation practices can actually optimize that point a little bit more, bring the brain a bit closer towards this point, which is similar to what we know of psychedelics already. And we now show that the same thing is possible with meditation. And yet we found that meditation is importantly different to psychedelics, where in the case of psychedelics, what happens is that certain sensory processing is less aligned and less attuned with what is actually happening in the environment. And what we find in this study is that in this critical point, it is actually a point that is more resonant, more attuned with subtle changes in the environment. So it is at this point of criticality in high alignment with the environment and not in isolation of the environment. And this then kind of we took further in a study with Christian prayer practitioners, where we asked them to pray. And what we found is in moments where they feel deep prayer, where they feel mostly connected to God, where they mostly feel like they can surrender to God, we find that the synchrony between the two brains of people praying in parallel is more synchronized. So in the moments of deepest surrender to spiritual practice here, the physiological systems of people practicing together get more attuned and synchronized. So this kind of is the complete story where in these practices, you have systems that are at criticality, so optimal kind of computational arrangement, in high attunement to sensory environments, and in high attunement to people you practice with, which is an interesting kind of combination of findings.
An experience of communion with the divine and with one another.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which might be the divine that you're communing with, might be physiological nervous systems in the environment.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Again, I'm thinking of how, beautiful that is and resonant, and certainly folks who have had shared ecstatic experiences with others, can probably, identify or will resonate with them as well, right? Like it can be so powerful and meaningful. This is how we connect, how we maintain community, right? And this is how we become inspired to go on crusades, right? Against the ecstatic practice down the road. Like, to me, it's just bringing it back to that alignment question or that worldview question. How can we have a greater, a wider and wider model that accepts and incorporates, whatever nervous systems are present, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's an answer to that. If some of the nervous systems that are present are animals that we need to eat, or who knows what we will discover with plant consciousness and all that. But
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
why do you want to be in alignment with the nervous systems down the road? Maybe they have to be enemies or maybe they're bad people.
Sure, and who knows? But there's something the research points towards, that certain alignment processes seem central to these practices, and there's like, that's not my field of expertise, but there's incredibly interesting work on kind of alignment between other organisms and plant organisms. A colleague of mine in our lab, she's doing the kind of synchrony work on people doing meditation and practices with environment. So how is the coupling between environmental stimuli like the waves of the sea or forests, how are those kind of informational structures correlating with our nervous systems? And do those structures change in these practices? So I don't think this alignment is just between nervous system, but between kind of us and the world more
Right.
generally.
Right. Jonas, how are you measuring this stuff? Like, if there is any like
Totally.
methodological geeks out there, this critical point, what are you using to capture this data?
So we have a mobile lab that I pack up in my suitcase. We then go to the retreat center. And what we have is some basic physiology. So we kind of measure skin conductance at the fingers, which is an indicator of stress. We have a few electrodes to measure the heart rate, or the ECG. We have belts around the belly to measure the breathing rates. We have temperature sensors. But the most important at the center is that we have these mobile EEGs. And
Wow.
EEGs are electroencephalography. They are these kind of little helmets that you wear on your head. And they have a bunch of little electrodes or measuring points. And what they pick up is the electrical activity of the skull. So in the brain, we have neurons, and neurons are responsible for kind of relaying information. And they can do that either chemically via kind of junctions between neurons. And in the neuron, when data travels, there's a little electrical field. And that electrical field of some neurons, not all, kind of travels to the skull, and there we can pick it up. And so now what we can measure is how active are certain populations of neurons at different parts of the brain. And with that activity, we measure the data, we then have it in the computer, and we can look at all kinds of things. And some of the interesting things is how structured is the activity? So given how the activity was for the last few seconds, how predictable is the data that is going to come forward? How is information traveling? Is it traveling in very kind of ordered patterns, or is it very kind of chaotic in how it travels? And so we now look at these kind of little relay stations and pathways of data, how it travels, or electrical activity, how it travels. And there what we find is in the state of meditation, of Jhana meditation specifically, data travels, it travels more consistent over longer time scales. So over longer time, you have a certain configuration of neuronal patterns that is repeated. So kind of there's a stability. But in the moment-to-moment activity, the types of information, the amount of different data points is a lot richer. So you have like a very rich amount, or like a very rich array of information that kind of visits a couple of different states. And that entire thing is somewhat stable over time. So you have like a stably rich kind of pattern. And that is one of the ways of how brain criticality is defined.
Are you just hooking people up for like their full day of sitting, or do you do like 1 hour where you're just hoping cool things happen? How do you set that up? Seems really complicated and so much data. Just the EEG must be overwhelming for anyone that needs to analyze it, but then you're doing all the physiology too.
Well, like that's why for the last retreat, we collected the data 3 years ago and we now publish the data. So it's a little bit of data collection and log analysis.
Yeah. How does it work? Are you taking a sample during the day, or you take like many hours of recording? Yeah,
during this last retreat that I just came back from yesterday, what we've done is the meditators are there for 10 days. They kind of do their own practice most of the day. And then every 3 days, every subject comes in every 3 days. So we do this every day. And they come in once a day for 2 hours. And then they just meditate with us for 2 hours with the equipment. And then afterwards, we take it off again. And they go back to the meditation hall. The next participant come and we put it on them. So we have kind of this rolling sampling, like 1 to 2 hours.
So cool.
And one thing that is incredibly interesting is there's always the worry that I have that kind of they used to meditate in this really quiet meditation hall. And now imagine you come out of this meditation hall, you come to this measuring room, and kind of there's a table set up with a bunch of computers, there's all this equipment, there's cables everywhere. And I was just like, how are they able to meditate in this?
Mm.
Or in an earlier study, we had to study in an fMRI where people needed to perform their contemplative practice in an MRI, and you're not sitting, you're laying, and it's like these MRI machines are super loud. And it's just like, how the heck are people able to do this in those machines?
Mm-hmm.
And once again at the study, we come out at the end, and then the practitioners, or some of them, tell us, it's been the best sit of my day. It really helped that I was like, I'm measured, I have high determination to really do a good sit, concentration was high. So there's something really interesting where
Cool.
even in this setting, people are able to not only do it, but excel in their practices.
Super cool.
I'm reminded of some psychedelic studies of taking similar measurements and having those kinds of reservations or challenges.
Yeah.
Jonas, I wonder if you'd tell us about your practice.
Sure.
And I know you're cautious to sort of you put put your hands up where you're like, I don't know, or I'm not sure I'm going to define enlightenment, but like, for yourself, what have you learned? What have you
Sure.
learned that's been helpful for you?
Totally. I'd be super happy to share. And you notice my reservation throughout this conversation because there's something I just want to kind of preempt with this, which is I'm kind of doing two things. I am doing this research, which gives me a certain level of authority. Right? We live in a time where people who do research, they're regarded as certain authorities, like a certain knowledge I have about these practices that many others don't have. Right? There's only a handful of people who are doing research on this. And then I'm also a practitioner who just does these practices. And I don't only practice, I also teach these things. But that is something where the research doesn't necessarily make me a better practitioner. It doesn't necessarily make me stronger authority in teaching these practices. And I think that is really important to keep those two apart. And that being said, of course, I love practicing these things. That's the reason why I invest all this time into the research. I don't know. I feel like, if I'm honest, I'm much more a practitioner, and being a scientist is just a good excuse to get a lot of time to sit on the cushion myself and practice.
Mm.
And it's been a big part of my life since about 10 years at this point, where much of my journey started back then, 10 years ago, where I kind of had my first couple of hours of sitting and then my first longer retreat. And there was this moment of, what people talk about, it is a lot more stunning how malleable perception is. I did not anticipate that my perception would be so malleable as I've experienced on these first few retreats. And then around that time, I also had my first psychedelic experiences, and I was just sold. I was like, there's something that is a lot more meaningful than any work I can ever do, which is getting to understand my own mind, how I relate, how I perceive, and trying to understand what configuration of mind is the one that I think is worthwhile pursuing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had many years of doing very classic shamatha vipassana practice, where the main idea is, in shamatha, what I do is I stabilize my attention, most commonly known on the breath. And I was just spending 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours a day sitting and stabilizing attention. And next to the vipassana is understanding what hinders me. What are the things in the world that pull my mind away? Might be worry about the future and whatever other emotions. And I've done that many years, and that cultivated a deep sense of joy and equanimity, and probably the most beautiful state I've ever experienced in my life, including psychedelics. And that was kind of what I've done for most of the practice. And then I got to know a teacher called Rob Bobea, and he has a really beautiful phrase and way of relating to practice, where he often takes the term beauty, and he takes the terms of kind of malleability of perception, but he often says ways of looking. So cultivate ways of looking. How do you relate to the world? And it then kind of gave agency back into my hand. It wasn't anymore just a concentration practice. In his writings, he encouraged me to experience myself. How do I want to go out in the world? How do I want to look at people? And since then, it became very humbling because now I couldn't just put myself and just put all the authority to a teacher and just follow. Now I had authority back and agency back and needed to kind of every day be kind of put to the trial. And that became a really, really beautiful journey that then over the last couple of months or the last 2 years integrated more Hindu tantric practices of integrating deities and kind of cultivating deities and having a relationship with them through imagining them, through mantras, some influences through Christianity and prayer, and using prayer and devotion, which are things that I was very, very averse to for most of my practice. Because prayer and devotion, it doesn't feel right to believe that there's something out there that I can't prove, something that can't put my EEG on. Like, what is that even? That feels not true. That feels like something that is cultish. And that kind of kept me far away from it. And it was then through this journey to noticing how the malleability of perception had ways of actually being a more generous person towards others, actually being kinder, actually feeling better. It was like doing devotional practices, doing prayer is another way of relating to me, to intention, to who I want to become. And it's been it showed to be incredibly useful and helpful. And since then, I keep trying to make the bridge between the science and practice more and more. And the aim that I have and what I would love to bring out there is towards my friends, and I teach these practices as well, is try to develop a language that is more and more precise, but not in a way that reduces practice, not a reductionist way. But can we have a precise language about the mechanics of something so unspeakable like devotion, like prayer, maybe about God, maybe at some point about awakening and enlightenment down the path. So that's my deep hope, to use my practice to inspire the work and kind of develop more and more precision in the work, that I can both have more precision in my own practice, but also in the way I teach and inspire others.
Jonas, really appreciate that. It's like really beautiful. And I got to say, I don't know if you were born like this, but when I see you, every time I see you, even today in this like totally virtual, impoverished platform we're on, it just blows my mind the joy and enthusiasm and love that you embody, like literally consistently. Every time I see you, maybe you have bad moods, but I haven't seen any yet. I just assumed, well, yeah. So actually, it's one of the questions I have for you. Is this a result of your practice, or were you always like that?
It's very hard to answer for me. I don't know. What I can say is that I had an incredible, fortunate upbringing. Right, I'm born in a country in Germany, a country that has a lot of wealth. I'm born in a family that had enough to kind of live well. I'm an only child, so there was always like I didn't really need to compete with siblings. I went to a school where I was treated incredibly well. I received incredibly good education. So my life is not marked by a lot of hardship. And so I think my environmental conditions, independent of practice, just gave me an advantage of just thriving. And I think the starting conditions might be very different for someone who comes out of a family where poverty is the norm, comes out of a family where emotional violence is common, maybe physical violence. I think that just changes the starting conditions very strongly. Um, so I think that's something where I just was really lucky in how I got here. And yet, while I was lucky up to the point when I started practice, there was still a sense I was like, where worry was still a thing, where not feeling well was still a thing. And I think through practice, there was a growing of just feeling well and feeling resourced and being able to get back. And it's not to say that that's always the case. This past year was the first year where I experienced pretty serious anxiety in my life. I didn't know anxiety before now, and I feel like with the finalization of my PhD and kind of starting other jobs in parallel, I'm just so squished in time, and it's really intense. and my system doesn't like it. And I get stressed and there's anxiety. And I'm just like, how can this happen? I've spent all these years practicing and yet I have freaking anxiety and get stressed and don't have the time I want to have to spend with loved ones. And that sucks. And it really sucks. And yet I can come to the cushion, and yet I can go to this retreat and spend 10 days. And it's not like that that there's nothing to do anymore. My plate is still full. Once we end this call, there's still tons of work to do. And yet I feel resourced and well in that. And it's almost like it's not so much about like feeling well or not in the moment to moment, but there's this extra layer where I just feel deeply safe. I feel deeply safe. I feel deeply resourced. And no matter how stressful or intense the moment to moment life is, it feels like there's this refuge that I have. And that refuge is something I don't think anyone can ever take away.
I got
Sound
one
like the
more
Buddha
follow-up.
touching the earth.
I got
This is
one
my
more follow-up
witness.
for you. Jonas, we spent a lot of time talking theoretically about what well-being is and what we should be pointing our practices to, right?
Yeah.
And as an academic, you can play, you can kind of hedge, you can be discursive about it. But in your own life, what have you learned about well-being and what you point your practice to?
Yeah, I love that. There's a couple of things. There's a few simple ones. The two that I keep coming back to when I'm confused in my own practice are spaciousness and relaxing. One of my teachers, Michael Taft, he often does this thing where he makes a fist and he's then just letting go. And all it takes to open the hand is not to actively open it. All it takes to open the hand is to just let go. And I find this such an incredible, powerful analogy, which so far has worked to any application in my life. That all it really takes is to let go. And not let go as in I don't care. Not let go as in like push it away. Let go as in just relaxing a tiny bit. If there's a certain craving to spend more time on the phone or eat another piece of candy, it is really just relaxing that tiny bit. To see through that and think if I actually want to do it. It's when I get too uptight about practice and get a bit grumpy at my roommates when they're too loud while I meditate. Relaxing a little bit more actually helps practice rather than being more rigid about it. When I get flaky and I'm just kind of totally avoiding practice and I'm just loosely going through the day, kind of just take a tiny bit of distance to that and think whether it's actually serving me. That really helps and has been a constant pointer back to the path. And like we said at the beginning, it's not really a fixed point, but it's really more like an attitude.
Nice. Sorry, Andrew, did you want to jump in? I had one other follow-up. I was really struck, first of all, this metaphor of refuge. You have this refuge available to you all the time, which is such a beautiful metaphor. And you mentioned like feeling safe, right? This, of course, I think is very, very appealing to people that are chronically anxious or traumatized or just struggling. Yeah. You may have answered this question already, but I wonder if you could just flesh that out a little bit further. Like, what are the practices or how did you get to having this refuge or finding safety? Is it related to this thing about just being able to relax a little bit?
Yeah. Let me tag on to that, because that's what I was going to say too, which is, Jonas's beautiful metaphor. I mean, this idea of letting go, right, is, I think, can really resonate with folks who have had that experience, maybe in meditation, maybe with psychedelics, of, oh, I was holding on to this thing and I had no idea, and I didn't need to add I didn't need to add a layer onto it. I needed to just release that. That can be so useful, and a lot of folks don't know how, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they don't have your karma. Like, or just as one way to put it, like, how do how can we support folks to get to that point? Like, what are some of those starting blocks to help folks get to that point?
So you got two questions, Jonas. We'll keep you on track if that's confusing.
I love that. So the two are like how to get people into this relaxing spaciousness. Does it cover yours as well, or is the?
I'm asking specifically about safety. I find that's a really interesting thing that I don't hear a lot of meditation teachers talking about, to be honest.
Yeah.
But it's very, very common in the therapy room.
I think two are related. I think the two are very related. Let me start with Andrews, and then I come back to the safety one. Like how to get there. Well, it's both then, right? Practice is utterly simple. It is just this. But it's also not simple. It is a very refined practice that takes years of training, and it takes good teachers, and that takes dedication and practice. Just like archery, you need to train a long time to become a really good archery kind of bowsman. So it takes practice here. And I think the best thing is to seek out some of these wisdom traditions. There's teachers out there that offer retreats. There's apps out there that teach these things. Apps have their caveats and have challenges with them, but it's one of the ways that I got into practice. So that there is like a thing of like, I'm saying it's easy, and yet it took me years to come to this point where I can speak about it so easily. And there's one specific mechanism that one of my teachers, Chula Dasa or John Yates, speaks about, which speaks to this safety point. And the practice is you want to recognize the difference between attention and awareness. All we've talked about in this podcast was how to navigate attention. And attention is this thing where it moves around and you bring it back to the nose or to the object or to the mantra. And you do that for so long, not so that attention gets rigid. You don't want to have a mind that only can focus on the breath. If you walk through the streets, you want to have attention that can take in the complexity of the world. The reason you stabilize attention in the Jhana practices is not to stay in Jhana for the rest of your life. There's something to be learned there. There's a certain insight. And one simple way of saying that is you now start to recognize that there's a larger field of experience that is able to notice when attention moves. Attention itself cannot notice itself moving. You need to have another layer of perception that is allowing the movement of attention to be known. And you now start shifting your practice from being identified with attention to being identified with this larger awareness from which attention is known. And I lift my hands to this, but it might be that once you start taking awareness as an object, maybe there's a deeper layer of awareness which is aware of awareness. I don't know how many layers are there. I also do not know if at some point the layer out of which I know my own consciousness is the same layer out of which you know your consciousness. That's metaphysical kind of conversations, which I love, but I do not know the answer to. And when you do this, when at some point you notice attention and at some point you turn attention back on itself, who is looking at this? Who is noticing that I'm concentrated or not concentrated? You start identifying that there is awareness. And you start noticing that this awareness is a lot more of who you are than the attention. And then you notice when you think of anxiety or depression or feeling unwell, the thing that is happening is that attention does certain things. Awareness doesn't really collapse. Awareness stays there and doesn't move much. And maybe there's other layers that are even more stable. And once you recognize this, of course, it sucks if attention does weird things. It sucks if attention does kind of this anxiety thing. But you still have this larger layer, which isn't really crippling. And that is what, for me, feels incredibly safe.
I think that's beautiful. And I'm also thinking of just like entry points, like this idea of from a practical perspective, there are so many folks who, not only don't have stable attention, right? But like just attention itself is a real challenge. And I wonder about making these practices accessible and allowing folks to make use of them. I think one of the reasons that psychedelics, so blew up in popularity over the last few years was just this like, attention and awareness on tap,
Yeah.
right? That can be very, very useful for breaking through a really tight, rigid system, and of course, come with it all kinds of risks, right? Um, and it's so interesting to see this wave of sort of meditation research, everything happening with Jhana. I was joking to Joe, I don't know how long ago, that psychedelics were the new meditation, like 5 or 7 years ago, and Jhana's the new psychedelics, right? But I
Yeah.
don't know about that insofar as what is the entry point for your average person
Yeah.
right now?
And I think you're right? Like psychedelics have a very strong effect, very quick. And it's not surprising that many serious meditation practitioners I know found an entry point through psychedelics.
Mhm.
And the main thing, right, I think there's lots of interesting work on psychedelics and in the therapeutic space. But one of the things that they very reliably do is showing you that consciousness or perception can be so much different than how you've known it. And maybe there's benefit by just pushing you into a different way of perceiving that's already nicer. What they can do for sure is just generate a knowing that then can encourage you to start doing practices. Only once you're aware that there's a totally different way of kind of relating to the world, can you really have the motivation to do the practice. Before that, you needed to rely on kind of stories of stories of teachers or friends. Right? Like if teachers or friends tell you there is this practice and you can do it and it makes your mind shift very well, then you need to just trust them. Now with psychedelics, you can have a first-hand experience that you can shift your attention. And through that experience, you can now kind of generate motivation to do these practices. Um, as a oh, as a starting point though, at the starting point, it might be as simple as download an app and just try it. Sit down for 10 minutes. Just sit down for 10 minutes and just get interested in what happens when you sit 10 minutes not trying to do anything. Um, what is your mind coming up with? Is your mind just still? Is your mind very distracted? That question alone is a really interesting question. And if you ask yourself that question for a little while, I think your mind will guide itself to a point where you will learn something. And I think that is valuable.
That's
And
wonderful.
maybe one more thing,
Yeah.
find friends who do this thing.
Yes.
We're in a time where these practices are more and more common. And I think most of us, like I'm pretty sure everyone who listens to this podcast will at least have one friend who's excited about these practices.
Mhm.
It is more and more common. And I don't think it's necessarily the conversation topic that kind of comes up naturally in all kind of communities. But I'm pretty sure that at least some level of sitting and meditation is known in all communities. So find someone who loves this and talk about it, because it is generating curiosity, that is generating momentum in the practice. And then the practice will generate more content for the conversations. And then you just start feeling yourself and kind of ramp yourself up.
So should the people should their nervous systems be in the same room so you can share the field that you're generating? What's the research pointing to there?
So far, I think that's definitely better. Like in my experience, it is still more powerful to be in the same room than not being in the same room. But having community online is probably still better than not having community at
Of
all.
course. Mm-hmm.
This morning, I woke up at 5 to sit with one of our friends online, and sitting there for an hour together in community is still so much nicer than sitting alone, even though you're not in the same space.
Didn't see. I joined at 5:30. Did you drop off? Did you drop off early? I didn't see you afterwards.
I dropped off a minute to the hour. I usually don't, and I was just like, I don't want to have the conversations today.
Right.
But
Right. I missed
too
you.
bad that I missed you.
That's all right. We got this time.
Jonas, can I ask you about mindfulness and psychedelics? Sorry, meditation and psychedelics. You talked a little bit before about how they're different. I wonder if you can just speak to like how you see these practices, what they have in common, what's distinct about them, and are they just two different tools that we use to achieve the same effect, or do they do something similar? I think, for example, one of the early kind of Michael Pollan compelling cases was about the default mode network and how both of these practices deactivate the default mode network and give us the state of like decentered, kind of like broader sense of self. So just wonder how you think about these two practices, similarities and differences.
Right, like I think there's Michael Pollan's kind of work, like, right, he really just summarizes work in the field. But there's the work on the default mode network. It's kind of a very popular story, both deactivated. And our research points a bit at that both is kind of advanced or like experienced Jhana practitioners and psychedelic people, like in both cases, you have the point where the brain is moved closer to its criticality, which is probably kind of somewhat correlated with the deactivation of the default mode network. You're less constraining the system, you're allowed to be more diverse somehow. So that's very similar, and it's surprising. And if you now listen to the experiences and the phenomenologies, there's many qualities that are very similar. One interesting paper that we've done with my colleague Joshua Brohinsky is on comparing jhana and prayer, right, which are both not psychedelic, but we have this dynamic between attention, arousal, and release. You pay attention, it kind of increases arousal, and then through this arousal, you can now deeply relax and release. And kind of there's this interplay between these three that moves through and through. And when I think of psychedelic, it's very similar. Something captures your attention, it creates a lot of heat and energy, and then you can kind of break through and release and relax into it. So neurophysiologically and phenomenologically, the two are very similar. So both of these practices, I think, are great to kind of kick you out of certain modes of perception. I think both of these practices are incredibly potent in kind of bringing you to a malleable state of some sort or another. Where the difference might be is in the second part, in the reintegration. So you're now in this malleable state. What do you take from this? What do you reintegrate? How do you want to kind of stabilize or kind of cool the system down? One of the psychedelic analogies is that you think of a block of metal. You heat it up through the psychedelic, and now it becomes malleable, you can form it. But it cools down and then it rests in the new state. I think it's a little bit similar in what meditation might do. In psychedelics, you don't have any built-in mechanism that is guaranteeing that this path is necessarily going the right way. In meditation, if practice and learn the right context, you have built-in practices that teach you this very process. The jhanas, they're not really the aim. The anecdote is the Buddha did not get enlightened in the jhana. He got enlightened when he went in and out of jhana. It was the coming in, the going in, the going in, the coming out, where he had the mindfulness practices to observe the pattern of the mind. There's something in that larger observation and reflection that then allows people to kind of notice how my states of consciousness change, and then step back and be like, which of these modes is actually beneficial? Which of these modes is actually one that I want to keep on taking into the future? Which of these will actually make me the person I want to be? And I think there's something like this that is built in the meditative path, that is built in the relationship that you have with the teacher, that is built into the Sangha, where the Sangha gives you reflections. Where I think in the psychedelic space, we're still trying to figure that out. I think psychedelic assisted therapy, there you have the therapist who does this very function. Um, and I think we're also more and more common in considering set and setting, community, when people do this at home. But I don't think it's as straightforward and is obviously built in.
The
Super
psychedelic
relevant.
space is definitely still working on those other pieces. And I think this is one of the things around sort of naming meditation as an equivalent when really it's a whole collection. It's a whole collection of systems, right?
Yeah.
And practices, some of which can be very analogous, to the melting metal experience, which I love. I've never heard that, but it's a nice alternative to the not too tight, not too loose
Yeah.
strings, right? Of getting something unstuck and getting it loosened up. So a Jhana practice, perhaps having that sort of equivalent potential, but then also of then reconstructing yourself. I wonder too about some of these other practices you're laying on, the tantric, the visualization practices, mantra, prayer, devotion, right? These seem more like deliberately constructive, as opposed to deconstructive.
Very
And then
much
also
so.
the actual, again, the worldview, the framework, the morality.
Mhm.
You were out of town, but your colleagues, Dr. Kyle Greenway and Michael Lifshitz, who's your supervisor at the lab at McGill, just hosted this symposium over the last week on the social determinants of
Yeah.
health related to psychedelic practice. So there is a lot of reckoning in the space around these other pieces that are so important, and ultimately, some of these things you mentioned, like really understanding set and setting, the context, all the nuance that is just an equal
Very much so.
part of this. Yeah. I wonder if that's a place to wrap up. I'm mindful of the time. No, you got to go, Jonas. Unless there's anything you wanted to add, or anything that's coming that you're excited about. Any new projects or anything you want to share
There's
with our
lots of
listeners?
cool stuff coming up. Maybe I'll keep that for a second. I think the last thing kind of to add to this conversation is there's so much exciting work happening on this, and the science is advancing so much, especially over the last couple of years. And yet, when I really think about what's the best indicator to know if someone is moving closer or further away towards the state we really want to cultivate,
Mm,
I still think our own experience of ourself is probably
mm,
still the best marker. Um, and that's interesting because I'm investing so much time in the science of this, right? And I like in the science and think about like how technology could like be more precise in measuring these things. And yet no measurement system can be more precise than our own experience and our own intuition. And in some ways it can never be that much more precise. We can develop technology that gets closer and closer towards mapping that. But somehow we could never really go beyond our own experience, right? Like all I can do is correlate whatever measures we have to our own experience. And I think that it's just really important to say that we can take back agency and at the end really trust our instinct, do a practice, join a community, and then check in. Does this seem helpful to me?
mhm,
Um, and I think that's just a good reminder for myself and for people listening to this, that like when you say not too tight, not too loose, what's the right balance? It's probably very personal to people.
mhm.
I think that's important to yeah, important.
People and their families, though, right? We should be asking their families if they're on the right track too.
We should definitely ask the families as well. That's sometimes like I'm like, sure, like there's moments when you get so obsessed about a certain practice.
Mm,
And often that's a problem, right? Like where you get kind of too obsessed, and that's where therapy is really helpful. What Joe said earlier, where it's like sometimes you don't want to just tell people that they're doing all right. You want to kind of challenge them. So I think that's really, really important. But I somehow feel like if people really dare to actually be honest to themselves, then
yes.
then they can be like, sure, I'm kind of caught in this loop and in this addictive loop or so. But if
Mhm,
I'm actually honest to myself, then doing this addictive pattern doesn't actually serve me.
mhm,
My instinct is that even people who are deeply stuck in this can recognize this.
mhm.
Um, yeah. And then lastly, to like what's coming up, it's there's a couple cool things. I'm so close to wrapping up my PhD. It's another like few weeks until I kind of put together the last few pieces. That's gonna be great. There's a new initiative that together with my housemate, Justus Wax, we started a pillar at the MIT Global Humanities Initiative, where we kind of bring our meditation practices into this kind of global humanities group of thinkers to think about how can we use these practices to meet global challenges, complexity, how can we find meaning, and in about a month's time, we're going to Seoul, where we kind of launch this pillar at a conference there. And I think that's going to be really, really beautiful. And so I'm just kind of excited to think about where does this meet the world and
Global
kind of see this
challenges. We don't have any of those.
Both global challenges, challenges of the mind, and finding well-being and meaning and purpose in this, I think, is questions that are important to sit with.
Well, thank you so much for sitting with all of them and your contributions to the world and to yourself.
And thank you both so much for hosting the podcast and for having me here today. It's always such a joy to hang with you, speak with you, both online and offline. And I really hope that these conversations get out there. And I'm so curious to see what you're going to do in this podcast in the weeks and months to come.
Me too. Thanks, Jonas.
Thanks for doing this, Jonas. Really, really fun.
We'll let you go. You're free to go.
Perfect.
Joe and I are going to sit and chat for a bit.
Do you just press the leave button at the bottom?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It was great.
Yeah.
I love the
Super fun.
There was like a package. It really distracted me. This
That was fine.
package delivery guy was so obsessed. And I loved where we ended up with these conversations. I feel like at the beginning there was like it took a little bit to like find which pathway.
A little bit of orientation. That's maybe on me, but we'll figure it out. We'll make sure it's coherent.
Yeah, it's fun. It's great that you're doing this. Take care. Ciao, ciao.
Okay. Bye.